Good evening, dear friends. I'm pleased to welcome you to the 360-degree assessment course. Today we have our first class of the course. The course website is on your screen and this is lesson number 1. Today we'll discuss what employee assessment is, specifically using the 360-degree method. We'll talk about the different types of surveys in general and what exactly the essence of the 360 method is. How is all this related to effectiveness? Why people fear this type of assessment and what people like about it. In the 360-degree assessment, this is our plan for today. In case we haven't met some of you yet, my name is Mike Pritula and the list of companies I've worked for is on the screen. Alpha Bank, Starlight Media, Wargaming, and Preply Ideal. And now I'm the founder of Mike Pritula Academy. Good evening. Good evening, friends who are joining us. We're just getting started. Speaking of the 360 assessment, I first started using it at Starlight Media. It was the STB TV channel. Then we used it at Wargaming to evaluate employees. At IDL, we already had an automated system, which I'll talk about in the last session. Well, now I'm observing that the 360 assessment is becoming quite a popular tool because many HR automation systems already include it by default. So it's become a widely accepted practice. In my work, I rely on best practices in this field, constantly monitoring various sources to share with you the most up-to-date, relevant, and useful knowledge. We have a private chat with the course participants called 360 Assessment. In this chat, I'll ask you to write about yourself, where you're located, what city you're in, what position you hold, and which company you work for. You can do this now if you have the opportunity, or you can do it later. Please write so that we can get to know each other. Just before we start with the theory, I want to prepare you and give you a heads up about homework assignments. There will be homework assignments for each lesson of the course. They will involve practical application of the knowledge gained during the lesson. For each homework assignment, you receive points on a 5-point scale. We have a maximum of 8 lessons with 5 points each, totaling 40 points. If you score at least 80% of this maximum, which is 32 points, you'll receive a diploma. If you don't score 32 points but simply complete all the lessons, you'll receive a certificate, which has less value than a diploma. The deadline for homework assignments is 2 weeks. From today, you have 2 weeks for today's homework assignment. So you have 2 weeks from each lesson. So let's get started with the 360 assessment. It's called a 360 assessment or 360 feedback. Companies can sometimes confuse different types of assessments and different types of feedback here. Companies know that we can launch completely different questionnaires and they may be unsure which of these are considered 360 and which are not. Good evening, Jen. Jen from Tbilisi is involved in consulting and coaching, among other things. Cool. Welcome. So, all the surveys or all the feedback that we conduct in the company can be roughly divided into micro and macro. To better understand how this is divided, what a real 360 is and what an incorrect 360 is, macro is where we collect information from all employees about some issue regarding the company, about satisfaction, engagement, loyalty, burnout, stress, benefits, and so on. So we're gathering some general information. This is all macro feedback, macro questionnaires, while micro feedback is when we can send out just as many questionnaires, still survey different groups of staff, but we collect information about one specific employee at a particular moment. Therefore, the 360 assessment is a micro questionnaire. Everything else and all other macro questionnaires, even though they may involve the entire company staff, are not classically considered a 360-degree assessment. What are the different types of assessments in general? So, a company can evaluate many things using surveys and other tools, covering a wide range of areas. For example, a company can assess results. A company can evaluate competencies. A company can evaluate employee motivation, personality types, job positions, teamwork, and so on. This is not an exhaustive list. And as for the 360-degree assessment, among all these, it's an assessment used to evaluate competencies and behavior, including issues related to corporate culture. Here's what we have. The 360-degree assessment is not used to evaluate pure results, motivation, personality type, or anything else, but rather specifically for assessing competencies and behavior. When should a company consider conducting a 360-degree assessment? When a company wants to manage its culture, meaning it has taken this issue seriously and needs a tool to measure where we are now. We want a certain culture, so how well do we currently align with it or not? That's the first question. Next, a company may be willing to invest in employee training, but doesn't know what to teach. And the 360-degree assessment can be a tool that objectively shows training needs. This way, the company will spend its money effectively. When else should a company consider a 360-degree assessment? When the company realizes that it's important for the business to evaluate not only results and key performance indicators, but also how they are achieved. In other words, it's important not only what people do and achieve, but also how they behave in the process. Furthermore, when teamwork is important for the company, the 360-degree assessment will gather team opinions about individuals and provide team feedback to a person on what they need to improve. Next, when a company is interested in building a flatter structure such as holacracy, teal organizations, or network structures, and the company wants to raise the authority of the teams themselves in terms of employee evaluation. That is, if in a classic hierarchical structure the manager evaluates everyone, in modern flat structures everyone evaluates everyone. And here the 360-degree assessment is almost the only way people can evaluate each other without a manager. Or for example, the company is interested in forming a talent pool. It needs to understand who has potential, whose competencies are better developed, and here too, a 360-degree assessment can be useful and provide a lot of valuable information. Or you need to assess leadership competencies in the company. That is, how much leaders demonstrate their competencies as managers, how well they really understand their role or not. This can be useful, for example, before launching a leadership development program to give them feedback on how they are leading today. Or if the company is interested in improving overall team productivity, a 360-degree assessment can be helpful here as well. These are probably the 8 most common cases when a 360-degree assessment should be applied. Then there are many specific cases when a company might launch a 360-degree assessment to address various tasks. So what is a 360-degree assessment? It's an assessment of an employee's behavior at work that is directly related to their effectiveness. So it's not about relationships, motivation, satisfaction, preferences, desires, opinions, and so on. It's specifically about behavior linked to effectiveness. It's not even about knowledge, not about what people know, but about how they apply that knowledge. Therefore, it's hard to find a better tool for assessing an employee's behavior at work. I'll explain later what other alternatives there might be and why they're not as good as the 360-degree assessment. Areas of application. Where can the 360-degree assessment be applied? There are 9 areas where it can be applied. In performance, that is, in evaluating a person's activities for the year, to assess their competence. In employee development, to identify areas for improvement. In leadership development, to identify areas for leader growth. And in selecting candidates for promotion, to understand who has better developed competencies. For building a talent pool, for managing culture, to measure how well people align with the company culture. For implementing changes, various changes can be accompanied by a 360-degree assessment to see if it's working or not, if we're actually implementing it. For teamwork and for improving service. So the 360-degree assessment, we'll be talking about it for certain employees, for example, for salespeople, for consultants, for account managers. For support managers may include customer opinions. And customer opinions are also valuable feedback that can be useful for improving future interactions with them. These are the potential areas of application for the 360-degree assessment. Goals and objectives. Now, more specifically, first of all, it's about assessing competence. That is, we measure behavior through competencies. In order to evaluate, most often, an employee's performance for the year, assess cultural fit, create a development plan, or select a leader. Why 360? Because it's like a circle. We know that the angle of a circle, so to speak, is 360 degrees, and that's how the assessment happens. When we evaluate a person, they are assessed by their manager, or in some matrix structures by 2 managers. They are evaluated by their colleagues, that is, those with whom they work. They are evaluated by customers if they work with customers like a sales manager would. They are evaluated by their subordinates if they have any, and they evaluate themselves. So it's as if the person is evaluated from all angles, hence the name, 360 degrees. What are the options? Options can be offline, paper questionnaires, and online using either Google Forms or specialized software. Offline, of course, is becoming more of a thing of the past. Even blue-collar workers are now being evaluated online, with factories installing either info kiosks or using chatbots. In general, everything is actively moving online. There are free online tools such as Google Forms. Today I will show one of the examples, and the penultimate session is entirely devoted to evaluation based on Google Forms. There is also specialized software. There are many different kinds of it, lots of variety. Today I will mention one option, and in the last session we will look at more options and compare their differences. These are the options for how a 360-degree assessment is conducted, what it includes, and what stages it goes through. The first stage is developing the competencies. That is, before evaluating someone or something, before giving out a questionnaire, we need to understand what we are assessing. Then the questionnaire itself is developed, launched, distributed, a report is prepared, and feedback is given. This is the complete cycle of a 360-degree assessment from the very beginning to the very end. If something is missing from this process, it is not a complete assessment. For example, conducting an assessment without feedback is not done. It is considered bad form to evaluate and not tell the person. Without developing competencies, it is unclear what to assess. It is ineffective to simply pick some random competencies from the internet. So this is what the process looks like. For most cases, as I said, it will be an online format, Google Forms you will have in the materials, who develops the competencies. The question here is, who conducts the assessment? Because if the assessment is conducted by the training and development department or the assessment department, they also develop it. And if, for example, the assessment is conducted by business partner departments or some other department, they will turn to the training and development department. So depending on who is in the company, what expertise that person has, they develop an assessment of specific competencies, usually those who are involved in people development, because the primary goal of competencies is to develop them. Of course, there are companies where there is only HR and it is one person wearing multiple hats. Yes, we are talking about the internal part. If it's the external part, then it's a consultant. There are a huge number of consultants. I'll talk about that a bit later. When consultants come in, they either take the company's competency model if one is already in place. If there isn't a ready-made competency model, they can offer to develop one as an additional service. Or many consultants offer a catalog of competencies and suggest doing what's called mapping in English or matching in Russian. So the consultants come in and we essentially have a competency database. There it is, 50 competencies for both managers and performers. Let's choose what we're going to evaluate. Position 1, we've matched the position, done the correspondence, and that's it. And then it's evaluated from there. So if you're considering for yourself, if I understand correctly, you want to offer this service to clients, for example, then it's preferable for you to have your own competency database that you can offer as a basis for assessment. We'll have a session specifically about development. I'll share an example of a competency database with about 30 of the most common ones in business. You can take these and use them to create a questionnaire for a 360-degree assessment. Let's move on. So it can be in this Google Forms format. Okay, there's no sound. I have a little hint now. I'll quickly write it down. Just a second. Here you already have an example of Google Forms with a 360-degree questionnaire. You'll be able to see what it looks like, but we'll cover Google Forms in more detail in the second to last session. Here's also an example of a competency profile. This is my example from one of the companies I worked for, where we developed a competency profile for implementing company values. It was built based on values, and we conducted the 360-degree assessment to evaluate how well people align with these values, again, as judged by the people themselves and their managers. It was also a very useful exercise. It seemed to match for the most part. In other words, we didn't uncover any critically alarming facts. Let's move on. It's important that a detailed report is provided after any assessment. We'll also analyze it after the assessment. The standard element in any report is information about how the ratings were distributed. Individual employee ratings are not displayed. Employee ratings are blended into one block, employees. Why? Because anonymity is preserved. What's not anonymous here is the manager's rating. Because there's usually only one manager, so their rating is, well, obvious. If the manager's rating is 2 and 6 or 2 and 9, it's clear who rated it since there's only one manager. But again, there are situations where there are 2 or 3 managers, in which case the ratings will be mixed. Examples will also be provided in the course. Next, what's the purpose? What's the essence of the 360-degree assessment? Why is it popular worldwide? Why is it being integrated into HR automation systems? Why do so many consulting companies offer it? Because the 360-degree assessment evaluates employee behavior. For assessing employee behavior, it's the best method. You can't come up with a better quality approach. More arguments will be presented now. Why? Why the focus on behavior? Because effectiveness is about behavior. That is, the right behavior will lead to effectiveness. And if we, from the perspective of 360-degree assessment, can improve the behavior of company employees by giving feedback, we will increase effectiveness. Therefore, it's fair to say that a 360-degree assessment is a powerful tool for improving business performance through employee development and through feedback from employees. So it's primarily about business efficiency. It is in general a business tool. And quite often the business itself is the client requesting the assessment. I mean, not HR or anyone else, but the business itself, because they understand how important and useful it is. And the more aware a business is, the more interested it is in such an assessment. The 360-degree assessment has been around for quite a long time. The origins of this assessment are thought to be somewhere in the 1950s or 1960s. There's information that NASA, for example, implemented a 360-degree assessment to evaluate employees in the space program when they were sending a man to the moon. By business, we mean the manager or the owner. So when we say business, it's either the CEO, the managing shareholder owner, or the top management team, those who represent the interests of the business. So NASA used the 360-degree assessment in the 1960s. In the 1980s, many companies started actively using it because court cases related to biased employee evaluations began to appear in the US. That is, in the 1980s, employees began to massively sue their employers for biased evaluations because managers were unfairly distributing bonuses, unfairly firing people, and in people's opinion, discriminating against women, people of different skin colors, different religions, and so on. And companies, in order to avoid all these legal costs, decided to use the 360-degree assessment as a method that couldn't be accused of bias. So there's the 360-degree assessment. Sure, the manager might be unfair, but we can see that everyone evaluated it this way. Consequently, the 360-degree assessment became, in its time, the perfect solution to problems such as favoritism and discrimination in evaluations. And today in the US, there are over 300 companies that offer 360-degree assessment services. Well, and leading consulting companies are also using it today. For example, Sakiel DDI companies and local ones. For instance, I was looking today at who else is using it. There's a TQ company in St. Petersburg. Many companies offer this. What's interesting? Almost all companies on the Fortune 100 list use the 360-degree assessment, almost all of them. Over 90% of the companies on the more extensive Fortune 500 list use some form of 360-degree assessment. And another argument I mentioned is HR automation systems. We'll be looking at them in the last class. They're also widely used. At the end of today's class, there will be a couple of sources, a book that talks about this. Let's move on. The 360-degree assessment has many names, but in Russian, it's most often called just that. Otsenka 360. Assessment 360. In English, it would be multi-assessment, multi-performance review 360. They say either 360 or assessment and so on. So there are many variations you might encounter in Russian. I translated it into Russian, but probably Otsenka po metodu 360, assessment by the 360 method, or Otsenka 360 assessment are the most popular. In English, these first two, multi-rater and multi-source, are very popular because they emphasize multi-rater, meaning multiple evaluators, and multi-source, meaning multiple sources. It's kind of an emphasis. You can also sometimes encounter, it's more of a marketing ploy. You might come across mentions of a 720-degree assessment or a 1440-degree assessment. For example, if two 360-degree assessments are conducted, they sometimes call it a 720-degree assessment. For instance, before and after some training, 2 assessments are done plus 1 equals 720. Or for example, a company implemented 4 assessments throughout the year. Quarterly 360-degree assessment, they said. We have a 1440-degree assessment, but it's all marketing. So essentially, it's still a 360-degree assessment. Sometimes it's the opposite. They even remove some. That is, sometimes they call it a 270-degree assessment or a 180-degree assessment when someone is excluded from this evaluation. But the 360-degree assessment is the most popular name. Why exactly 360? As I said, it's different sources, internal and external. Usually it's people from above, below, sideways, and the employee themselves. And in this case, the employee receives very objective information about themselves, which is very important. Definitely. Well, we'll talk about this in other classes. A mandatory assessment from those who know the person well. In other words, those who don't know the person, haven't worked with them, or haven't encountered them won't be able to evaluate them. Therefore, the evaluation is done by members of the employee's work circle. And all 360-degree assessment scales usually include the response option, I haven't had the opportunity to observe. Because we can't always observe all the competencies being assessed in our work. Why use a 360-degree assessment? It determines how a person interacts with others. This means we can improve teamwork, evaluate the effectiveness of a person's behavior, and show the consequences of their behavior. So they finally see a cause and effect relationship. For example, I'm not a team player, I don't help anyone on the team, and I'm fine with that, end of story. But here in my assessment, I see that I've failed across the board. Everyone gave me low scores because I'm not a team player. I realize that my bad behavior has finally led to something that makes me think. It allows you to identify strengths and weaknesses. It's really great for development. It can uncover blind spots that hinder career development. So a person might have hit a glass ceiling, wondering or not understanding why they're not being promoted despite trying so hard. And it turns out that there's some factor the person didn't notice, and that's the reason they're not being promoted. It's important to understand that this is not about assigning a rating. It's more about assessing the effectiveness of a person's behavior. The focus here is not on punishing those who receive poor ratings, but on helping the person improve their behavior. Helping is first and foremost the main focus. Well, it's also a good catalyst for implementing changes. For example, changes such as leadership development training are difficult to implement without a 360-degree assessment. That is, executives most often think that everything is fine, they know everything, everything is great, so they don't need to learn anything. And then the 360-degree assessment comes in, and it turns out that both employees rated poorly, and the superior said, "Yeah, you're not a very good manager." And colleagues also point out our areas for development. And for the person, it's a reason to think, wow, it turns out there really is such a problem. Let's move on. After the assessment, very detailed reports are prepared and given to the person. You know, if I can argue about my competencies. Here I was given these reports where everything is detailed. Grades, scores, areas for development. And these are documents that you can't argue against. In other words, you realize that the numbers speak for themselves. So it's a powerful way to get people to change. Because people change not when they are required to, but when they see a need. And the results of a 360-degree assessment are a visible need. Here's your competency. It should be at a level of, say, 4 points, but you have 2. And the person already understands on their own that there is indeed a need. Consequently, people change when they understand and value feedback from colleagues, and when they realize that by changing their behavior and their work, they can get a different result. So a 360-degree assessment can really help people start to change. What does a 360-degree assessment provide? What are its outcomes? A list of strengths? Actually, it's a useful thing too. A person understands that these are their strengths and can rely on them. Hidden strengths can be revealed. A person might not even know, but it turns out they're great at something according to the assessment results. Perhaps this will be a reason for the person to think about some kind of development, either in their career or taking on a project. That is, to feel more confident and stop doubting what they were unsure about. It will also show the need for development and reveal blind spots and barriers in one's career. And it's a great source for further employee development and training. So from the perspective of personnel development in a company, a 360-degree assessment is also one of the best sources. Compared to other techniques for identifying development plans, if not a 360-degree assessment, for example, what are the alternatives? What else can companies use? Let's review and understand the disadvantages of other methods compared to a 360-degree assessment. Am I correct in understanding that in the assessment report the feedback is anonymous and specific colleagues or sources of feedback are not identified? Yes. Specific colleagues, their evaluations, and their comments are not indicated. The scores are combined, and an average is calculated. It's shown as an average for colleagues, an average for subordinates, for example. In other words, they are divided into groups, but averages are presented, and the comments are also mixed together. Here's what your colleagues are saying about this. Moreover, even if a comment is very, how should I put it, identifiable, that is, if someone can guess who wrote it, the administrators may even slightly rewrite the comment or anonymize it to prevent identification. Yes, because that's the format in which it's conducted. Because as soon as it's not anonymous, people are most afraid. We'll talk about these fears now. They're afraid to evaluate. So, let's discuss alternatives to the 360-degree assessment. Regular one-on-one meetings are a source of continuous feedback from the supervisor. It's a good thing, but it has a drawback. The supervisor doesn't always see all their employees at work, and not all employees. Therefore, objectively, the supervisor cannot be the only source of feedback. Colleagues interact with an employee much more frequently and can provide more accurate feedback. Assessment Center for evaluating all competencies. It's a great tool that can compete with the 360-degree assessment, but it's expensive. Assessing one person using the assessment center method costs between $1,000 to $2,000. The 360-degree assessment will either be free if using Google Forms, costing only people's time, or if some system is used, it will be for a minimal fee. So it usually doesn't cost much compared to the assessment center. Self-assessment during a performance review can also be used to identify areas for development, and the supervisor can then comment, but again the employee won't see their own blind spots. That is, without input from colleagues, they might miss some important aspects. Conducting employee performance appraisals or testing, instead of a 360-degree assessment, won't be as effective either because it will assess a person's knowledge, but that doesn't necessarily reflect how they behave in practice. That is, if we assess that a person understands what it means to work in a team, it doesn't necessarily mean that they actually behave that way with people in practice. Next, you can collect training needs directly from employees. Yes, you can. But again, employees might misjudge their areas for development, which the 360-degree assessment quite often reveals. Collecting needs can be done through managers, but managers also have limitations. Firstly, it's actually difficult for them to specify development areas for each employee. Secondly, they might not remember certain facts. And competency-based interviews. For example, if instead of doing a 360-degree assessment to select a candidate for promotion, we conduct a competency-based interview, such an interview would be less objective, and the person conducting it would need to be very thoroughly prepared. So those alternatives that either exist or are used in the company for the same purposes where a 360-degree assessment can be applied, these alternatives fall short compared to the 360-degree assessment. So the 360-degree assessment is a much more effective tool in this case. Now let's talk about possible drawbacks, because everything seems nice and cool so far, but there are indeed a few disadvantages. The first disadvantage is that people might be afraid of the 360-degree assessment. For example, those who are evaluating might fear that their responses will not be anonymous. And they will either ignore this questionnaire or inflate their ratings just so they will not be found out and told, "Damn, Misha, why did you give me such a bad rating? I cooperated with you, I helped you, remember, and here you are judging me harshly." Furthermore, employees worry about how the assessment will affect their rating. In general, how their salary will be reviewed afterwards, and so on. In other words, they do not feel confident about such an assessment. And basically, all the main fears that exist are related to the misuse of the 360-degree feedback. If used correctly, these fears can be avoided. What are managers afraid of in a 360-degree evaluation? Most of all, they fear losing their authority. When there is no evaluation, they can manage employees as they see fit, because they will be the ones reviewing salaries and assigning bonuses later. If an employee behaves in a way that pleases the manager, they will get a bonus. However, when a 360-degree evaluation is implemented, the manager's opinion gets diluted by other opinions, and the manager loses control. Or conversely, they are afraid to honestly and truthfully evaluate an employee and show them that they are not performing well. Because the manager's evaluation in a 360-degree assessment is not hidden. It is not anonymous, it is very specific. That is, among the assessments for each competency, there will be the manager's evaluation. They might also be afraid to give an honest assessment. What subordinates fear when evaluating their managers? They are afraid that managers will figure out who gave them what rating, and if they gave a low score, they fear the manager will find out and retaliate. Here is a comment in response. There have been cases where participants gave an inadequate evaluation of a colleague out of envy or enmity, or conversely, to cover for themselves. Yes, we will be discussing this. For that, we need to collect comments. It is essential for all evaluations to request examples and not to accept them without examples. In other words, remove such evaluations. Also, there are more complex approaches where evaluations from different people are compared by different evaluators for different evaluees. There are approaches where evaluations are adjusted based on how accurately the evaluator assesses the person being evaluated. We will talk more about this later, but the most basic thing is to collect comments. Next, subordinates fear retaliation and criticism from managers, so this also needs to be taken into account. What colleagues fear when asked to evaluate one of their peers? They're afraid of being identified as well. They're afraid that if they give a low score now, the person will find out it was them who gave the low score, and they'll give them a low score in return, and some even play it smart. They give high scores and say, "Listen, I got your questionnaire and I gave you high marks. When you look at my questionnaire, keep that in mind." So this can happen too. And they might think that this is just another piece of nonsense in the company, that it's not important or necessary. We'll be discussing in the course how to avoid all these mistakes, even if we talk a little about it today. What team members are afraid of. In this team evaluation, they're afraid of being identified as the weakest link. What clients are afraid of. If a company involves this aspect, like clients, and I said it's appropriate for sales department employees, for support department employees, they have concerns that if they evaluate now, the company will expect them to buy more from them, or that the company will find out that I actually think they're a bad company, but I'm only with them because there are no alternatives. Some worry about their relationship with the seller. These are regular purchases. If I give him a bad evaluation now, he'll treat me poorly, and we'll have a difficult relationship. Some are afraid of causing harm. For example, someone might be unhappy with how a salesperson behaves, but the salesperson isn't a bad guy, so they won't give him a low score to avoid getting him fired. This can happen. What are the participants afraid of? Those who are being evaluated themselves? Firstly, those who are weak are afraid of getting an evaluation, and they know it will confirm that they are weak. Some don't like feedback at all. By the way, I read a study that Generation Y, for example, wants feedback while Generation X didn't. More of them want feedback. They're used to it, social media, regular feedback, likes and other things, reposts. Furthermore, some prefer to give feedback and criticize rather than receive it. Some simply don't trust the process. Some think that this is also, a remnant of the Soviet mentality, a Soviet mindset. Some believe they have full rights to the position they hold, that no one should supervise them, no one should evaluate them or give them feedback. In short, what's the point of all this? This is my job, I do it, it's a big and complex topic. And some fear retaliation from colleagues thinking they might have actually been rude or disrespectful to someone at some point. Now they think that person will get back at them. Participants may have such concerns as well. Now, what do people like? It's not just negative aspects. Indeed, there are things that people like about the 360-degree assessment. Firstly, they understand that it's real help in employee development. That is, many people are happy to receive some kind of report, and they look forward to it. Next, it helps identify strengths to build upon in their work. In other words, I can use this tool to understand what I'm good at and focus more on it, utilize it more. It helps in finding areas for development. That is, I can understand what I need to learn. Removing career obstacles, meaning I can identify what was hindering my career development and why I wasn't being promoted. It helps realize potential, and generally, effective and motivated employees want to receive feedback. That's all of it. These concerns are more likely to be held by ineffective employees, not by the effective ones. So when making a choice, listen more to the company, listen more to effective employees. What do people specifically love about the 360-degree assessment? Firstly, a clearer understanding of strengths and development needs, a comparative perspective with those they interact with on a regular basis. So the company can even show the average score for the department, for example, telling a person, your score is this, the average score is that. Furthermore, if the company has set everything up correctly and doesn't intimidate people, then the individual understands that it's a good conversation that doesn't lead to any dangers. Next, it's a way to get feedback and grow. It's not criticism. It guides, it helps, it allows for better communication with one's supervisor. And overall, it's a good way to build interaction. This is what people love about 360-degree feedback. How to reduce fears associated with the 360-degree assessment. It's important to understand that in any process, in any project, there are always skeptics. Those who are skeptical even in the most excellent processes. Next, people aren't afraid of the 360-degree assessment process itself. In principle, they're not scared of evaluation. What they most often fear is how you will use the results. That is, how the results will be used. Therefore, we need to work more on this aspect and explain to people how it will be used. What needs to be done for the assessment to be effective in the company? We need to understand what barriers currently exist, analyze them, and work through them. What, for example, could it be? For instance, there could be a scary story. Someone might say that when a 360-degree assessment was conducted somewhere to downsize staff, they ended up laying off everyone. These are the kind of stories that can circulate. It's important to identify these stories, understand what people are saying, figure out if there's any truth to them or if they're completely false. Why did it happen that way then, and how can we avoid it? So, communicate to everyone that it was an untrue story and that things will be different with us. Next, it's very important to clearly and thoroughly communicate the purpose of the 360-degree assessment, why it's being conducted, how the results will be used, whether it will affect compensation or not, And if it will, how and what else it might impact. This is what people need to be told clearly. And if you handle this well, that is, if you work through all the scary stories, the false ones, clearly communicate the results, explain, present it. We'll talk about this, then most likely everything will go well. In other words, the right approach and the right design allows you to avoid all of this. It's also very important to continue communicating with people during the presentation, launch, and follow-up. That is, people must have the opportunity to reach out to someone and get advice, receive feedback on support, and on survey-related issues. Ideally, there should be someone in the company who is the face of this project for the people. Next, it's important not to rush. It's important to determine why you're doing this now, what your goal is, to conduct a few trial sessions, that is, to first present to a small team. Maybe even launch a 360-degree evaluation for a pilot group, see what worked and what didn't. Accordingly, remove what didn't work, strengthen what did work, and then roll it out to everyone. So there's no need to rush quickly and immediately launch an assessment for everyone. Everyone's already frightened, everyone doesn't understand how it's going to be used, and so on. It should be systematic, measured, efficient, with the right approach, and then there won't be the problems and fears that might arise. It's very important to be clear about the outcome. What's going to happen? Who will receive the information, especially who will have access to individual employee responses? Because that's crucial. If you say that the department, the manager, and so on will have access to employee responses, it will undermine credibility. It should be that only I have access to the individual responses. I'm the project manager, no one else has access. Who will see the results? Probably first and foremost, the employees and their managers should see them. How will we react if some high-level manager comes and says, "Come on, show me the answers about me or about this employee separately for each person. Show me the individual responses, not the mixed ones." How will you maintain confidentiality? Think about it in advance. In principle, this can be done at the questionnaire design stage. That is, when you send the questionnaires anonymously and you don't know who specifically filled out the questionnaires for this employee. So you know who it was sent to, but you don't know exactly whose questionnaire is in front of you right now. This is important to think through. Platform. There are several platforms. Again, in session number 8, the last session of the course, we'll look at different platforms. I'll present the current Russian language and English language ones. What is a platform for your understanding? Those who, for example, initially expect from this course that we'll study everything, but in the end we'll definitely be automating. I call a platform an automation system that will allow many things to be automated. What it will allow to automate. For example, it will provide ready-made letters. Some of these platforms even provide ready-made competencies and questions. So you simply choose what you want to evaluate. Here's a link that comes to the employee. Third, addition of forms and just a report, an example of how you do it by platforms. Let's stick to the method. I've lost something, just a second. That is, the cannot evaluate answer must be available because a person may work closely with the person being evaluated, but might not have been able to observe some competency. Here. By the way, I want to point out this is not the best example of a questionnaire because there are no questions about what is needed. More specifically about examples of competency assessment. That is, I would not recommend adding too many questions. Here we already see 34, 35. I wouldn't recommend doing it like that. So I'll show you different platforms that are available and give general recommendations on what to look for in a platform. Assessment results. Take note, this is called a spider graph or radar chart. This is how competencies are usually assessed. It's an employee who has competencies being evaluated and there's an assessment. There are assessments from different participants, and you can see where the self-assessment is higher than others, where it might be lower, how the manager evaluated, how the subordinates evaluated, and where we have differences in the assessments. So this type of chart is one of the quite popular ones for presenting the final results in an assessment. Homework for those already in the course. Today's will be quite simple. Today we'll be working with concerns and fears. For this, you'll need to discuss the 360-degree feedback with colleagues and gather their concerns, expectations, horror stories, and myths. Either with your team or the whole company, describe what you'll do to address all possible fears your colleagues might have. This will depend on what you've come up with in this step. Here you'll describe what concerns we've discovered. For example, people might fear that it won't be anonymous, so we'll do this, this, and this to address it. With this, our first session is coming to an end. In the second session, we'll discuss how to create a questionnaire. Show me what you've written or I'll fire you, says the big boss in a fatherly tone. So, If that's the case, what should be the response to keep both the wolves fed and the sheep unharmed? Ideally, knowing there's such a boss, we should create a questionnaire where we can't tell who gave which answer. So for example, we'll use Google Forms. We won't collect information about who answered. We'll just gather responses, for instance, from subordinates about their boss. And tell me what you wrote. We don't have any names. We just have anonymous questionnaires here. And again, we must ensure that the questionnaires are not identifiable. Perhaps we should specify in advance to write in a way that can't be traced back to you. In other words, don't write in your characteristic style, but use general language. Well, anyway, and that's it. Then if he asks for the questionnaires and names, we can say we didn't collect names as it was a condition for guaranteeing anonymity. That's how it is. That way, both sides are satisfied, so to speak, but he doesn't get any specific information. As for books in Russian, there are actually very few. I only managed to find one recent frequently mentioned book on 360-degree assessment. There's a better selection in English. There's a good book about 360-degree assessment that specifically talks about Fortune 500 companies. I think you can Google it. That wasn't my goal. I mean, I generally trust that Fortune 500 companies use these assessments. I know they're popular, but you can find more information if you want. This concludes today's session. Please write in the chat what was most valuable for you today. What are your key takeaways? What thoughts or insights are you leaving today's session with? We'll meet again in a week at the same time. Come online to listen. It was interesting. Everything was new. Thank you. Yes, you're welcome. I'll be expecting you in a week. The method worked great in practice. It's excellent that it's been automated. Yes, indeed. Excellent. Thank you. You're welcome. Yes. All right, then. That's all for now. See you soon. Bye-bye. We'll continue in 1 week. Have a good evening. Likewise.